judgment been okay, and he lost his life. The princess lost her life as well. But in regards to, and by the way, does it take critical thinking to drive an automobile successfully? It actually does not take critical thinking. This is why we allow college students to do it. And high school students that are in their junior and senior year. It takes judgment, but it doesn't take critical thinking. Critical thinking, an example of critical thinking is, some of you realized I got here by private airplane yesterday that I piloted myself. And under instrument conditions, when you can't see, and one of your instruments goes bad, particularly if it's something you're not trained for on how it went bad, that requires critical thinking because it's a new problem and you're having to solve that problem in flight. This is what happened to Air France when they were going from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. Those pilots, there were 3 of them, they were in instrument conditions, and one of their instruments went bad. Now, there's only 6 primary instruments to fly an airplane successfully in instrument conditions, and you can do without any one of those, and you can be able to make up the difference with the others. And so when an instrument starts to go bad, you have to figure out which one is it that's going bad. And when their instruments started to go bad, their airspeed indicator started to actually show too high of an airspeed. Now, Airbus, I'm getting into some of the complex things. The difference in Boeing has been trying to catch up to Airbus in some ways, but Airbus trusts the computerized system more than it trusts pilots. Where Boeing, prior to a few years ago, always trusted pilots more than it did computerized systems. Now, there was a reason why both companies took this approach. Airbus took this approach because Airbus is a cheaper aircraft, and so the third world countries, when they had limited resources, they were going to buy Airbus, and their also pilots were not near as highly trained as our pilots are in the military and all of those sorts of things, and so they always built the computer system to kind of override the pilot. And so when the airspeed indicator was too high, how do you slow down an airplane quickly? It's not flaps. This will do it quicker than flaps. You actually pull up and you put that nose to the sky, and it'll slow down very quickly. And so the nose was put to the sky by the computerized system, and the airspeed went back down. But now they noticed the altitude was losing. 4,000 feet a minute. They're, up there at 38,000 feet, and they're going down 4,000 feet a minute, and their airspeed looks okay. And they know something's wrong. This plane is dropping out of the sky, and what do? They even woke up one of the pilots. They had 8 minutes to figure it out. None of them figured it out. And all of them died. And that whole aircraft was lost because they didn't have critical thinking. Why didn't they have critical thinking? All of them had drank alcohol within 72 hours. And it turns out it takes 30 days for the brain to fully recover as far as critical thinking is concerned. And so if we want to have the best critical thinking, we're actually going to be teetotalers. Now, in our society today, and this has been talked about on the highest levels, even at the FAA knows this, but they state we can't get this passed that pilots have to be teetotalers because we'd have to fire 80% of our pilots, and there wouldn't be enough pilots to be able to fly around. Now, your pilots are good if they just have to fly from point A to point B and none of the equipment goes bad and they're not in instrument condition. So I don't want to scare you that are into getting into your next airplane. But if all of those things, this is the perfect storm, when you're in instrument conditions and an instrument goes bad that you're not specifically trained about, you want to be able to have that critical thinking. And this is why it's so important for sometimes even life itself. So once again, 30 days for critical thinking to come back. Nicotine has a more suppressant effect on the frontal lobe. But another area of the brain, or another substance that's more commonly consumed than even alcohol or nicotine is what? Caffeine also has its effect. Caffeine blocks the adenosine receptors in the frontal lobe, and so there is frontal lobe compromise that goes on. How does this manifest itself? One study showed that when you have caffeine on board, you're much more likely to gossip than when caffeine is not on board. And of course, they had to measure what gossiping was. Gossiping is sharing private information with someone who's not part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem. So it's not that you're telling an untruth. You're telling true things, but you're telling it to someone who's not part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem as you talk about somebody else. And studies show you're much more likely to do that under the influence of caffeine. Caffeine does suppress the frontal lobe, that it even makes a difference in some sports. What's the most popular sport in America? Football. And it turns out there's only one player on a football team that requires an intact frontal lobe to be successful. That's the quarterback. Why does he have to have a frontal lobe? He's analyzing information and having to make a decision with that information. And studies show now in quarterbacking that they make far better decisions with zero caffeine. So the quarterback coaches are telling their quarterbacks, get rid of caffeine. By the way, Tom Brady makes it very clear, never utilizes caffeine at all. There's attempted murder going on all around him, and his emotions stay calm, and he makes a wise decision with the ball. It wouldn't happen if caffeine was on board. You'd get a lot more jumpy. This was an interesting study done by Duke University. By the way, on this study on caffeine and gossip, it's kind of interesting that Ellen White talked about that very thing. She said when these tea and coffee users meet together for social entertainment, the effects of their pernicious habit are manifest. All partake freely of their favorite beverages, and as the stimulating influence is felt, notice what happens. Their tongues are loosened, and they begin the wicked work of talking against others. Their words are not few or well chosen. But a lot of people feel it's necessary in their case. Why? Because without it, they're a zombie in the morning, and they need that energy in the morning. Or it's because they have headaches without it. And so they need the vasoconstrictive effect of the caffeine. Measurements showed that caffeine users' post-caffeine levels of alertness were actually no higher than non-caffeine consumers who received a placebo, suggesting caffeine only brings coffee drinkers back up to normal. In other words, all the reported benefits of caffeine are present virtually all day in energy levels only in those who what? Who don't consume it. And so you're getting the pick-me-up because you're under a withdrawal at that point. And so you're just getting rid of the acute effects of withdrawal. And if you got off of it completely, you would actually have the energy level that is far better. Peter says, gird up the loins of your mind. In other words, let's get our brains as sharp as they can be. Be sober and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. By the way, that word be sober in the Greek means be abstinent. In other words, abstinent from anything that's going to adversely affect our brain's ability. So what does the frontal lobe desire for optimal function? Carbohydrates are used almost exclusively by the brain for optimal function. And of course, the foods that are high in natural carbs are your fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables. That works best for the frontal lobe. Ministry of Healing quotes those 4 food groups and says they impart a strength, a power of endurance, and a vigor of intellect that are not afforded by a more complex and stimulating diet. And it's a diet that we have at Weimar. But since sugar is a carbohydrate, when we first discovered how much carbs are used by the brain, we thought sugar might be helpful, at least some scientists did, and they studied it first in school-age children, and they found out the exact opposite. Large amounts of sugar in the diet actually impair frontal lobe functions in school-age children. And what happens when you have that candy bar is there's a spike in the blood sugar. Our pancreas thinks we've eaten large amounts of fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables, so it cranks out a lot of insulin, and then it plummets, and that plummeting hypoglycemia, even though we put in some mechanisms to prevent it from going down under 50 or 40, the body tries to respond the other way. But once it goes down to subtle hypoglycemia, it'll take 4 hours for the brain to recover. So even after you snack and get the blood sugar back up again, it's still going to impair frontal lobe performance, and it makes about a grade letter difference in school-age children because some subjects require their frontal lobe. Arachidonic acid is also a substance that is like pouring fuel on the fire in regards to inflammation. Depression and anxiety are actually thought of as inflammatory disorders of the brain. And we'll actually measure inflammatory markers when people come through our program. And arachidonic acid decreases the synthesis and storage of acetylcholine, plus it's going to cause some inflammatory effects. This is why in post-traumatic brain injury, we don't want to have arachidonic acid around. And it's present primarily in flesh foods, but it's also present in meat and eggs and fish. It's not present in dairy or any plant foods. And another reason why a more plant-based diet has been shown to be very helpful in randomized controlled trials in regards to optimal mental health. Ellen White said eating much flesh will diminish intellectual activity. Students would accomplish much more in their studies if they never tasted meat. When the animal part of the human nature is strengthened by meat eating, the intellectual power diminishes proportionately. And then there was another interesting study on intelligence by a European journal, the British Medical Journal, and it showed children with high IQs are more likely to become vegetarians when they grow up. So not only becoming plant-based helps your IQ and your EQ, but if you have a high IQ to begin with, you're more likely to go that direction later on in life. A study of more than 8,000 men and women age 30 whose IQs have been measured when they were 10 showed that the higher the IQ at age 10, the greater the odds of becoming a vegetarian by age 30. For each 15-point rise in IQ in the study, the likelihood of becoming a vegetarian rose by 38%. And this was true even after adjusting to factors such as social class and education. The link was still consistent. And of course, this begs the question, why is this happening? You remember the original study on IQ showed that when you have a higher IQ, you're likely to live longer. And they were wondering why that's the case. But when you get a look at the definition of IQ, it shouldn't be a surprise. Do you remember what the definition of IQ is? Your ability to do what? Learn, retain, and apply knowledge. So if you have a high IQ at age 10, you're more likely to learn about the benefits of a plant-based diet. You're more likely to retain it, and you're more likely what? To apply it, and that helps you with your longevity. And so that's the link between high IQ and longevity, is you're more likely to actually apply that knowledge. By the way, often I'm asked to speak in a lot of different sectors that are not at all plant-based or vegetarian, but they're asking me to speak because of the mental health studies and the aspect of that. And I was just over in Washington, D.C. I mentioned in speaking to a group of actually the higher-ups in the Native American world, because there's such a high risk of suicide and depression and those type of things. And there's a Native American embassy that represents the over 100 tribes there. And of course, often when I'm in those environments and I'm eating with them, they'll notice I'm eating differently. And so often the question comes up, oh wow, are you a vegetarian? And so I will say, well, yes, I am. And you know what the next question is? Why are you a vegetarian? Well, as a result of this study, you can just answer it very quickly, high IQ. Actually, that would show low EQ if I said that. So I've been tempted to say that, but I've never actually said that. Physical exercise is also very important for optimal brain function, and studies show getting fit. Actually, as good as exercise is on your body, it's actually even better for your brain. And so being fit is a critical aspect of optimal brain health, but also not just being fit in regards to aerobic exercises, but also working with your hands has been shown to be helpful in intelligence. Working with one's own hands in a real-world 3D environment is imperative for full cognitive and intellectual development. Research is showing that increasing time spent in the virtual world of computers is displacing hands-on play and hands-on learning. 3D learning allows young people to experience how the world works in practice, to gain an understanding of materials and processes, and to make informed judgments about abstract concepts. And of course, one of the big concerns of educators today are how are most kids learning? On screens. That's two-dimensional. You know, even if you wear your 3D glasses, it's still two-dimensional. That's just fooling yourself that it's actually 3D. And it is a 2D world, and this is actually impairing that full cognitive and intellectual development. This is why I talked about earlier, if you're working with your hands, with flowers, and you're doing things with your hands. In fact, in our Optimize Your Brain class at Weimar, they have to, in order to get an A, they have to work with their hands 20 minutes a day, 6 days a week. And those students that are used to the computerized world before they come to Weimar, they're very kind of perplexed. What am I going to do with my hands for 20 minutes? You know, how can, you know, and of course they're asking, you know, isn't pressing these buttons, 3D? No, not touching the screen is either. And so, we'll tell them, you might want to actually wash your own dishes, or, there's a whole list of items that we give them to do, including some of them like this if they can't find anything else, including playing ping pong, that's at least three-dimensional. Playing a musical instrument, playing a violin is three-dimensional. And so there's a lot of different ways. Going out in the garden, the agricultural part of things. I should tell a study of Lance. Lance was one of our challenging students. He was actually not accepted to Weimar, his first application. And I'm not part of the enrollment committee, so I'm not part of that decision-making at all. But it turned out he was known by one of our board members, and so the board member, of course, talked to me when he didn't get accepted. That's often the phone calls I get if people have a connection with Dr. Nedley and their loved one doesn't get into Weimar. I get a phone call. But normally it doesn't change after that because the enrollment committee knows what they're doing. But nonetheless, he was turned down, and one of the reasons why he was turned down was because of the emotional issues that he had. At age 15, he was in a juvenile detention center. At age 16, he went to a place for all boys to try to enhance his brain, but it actually did work. It was, is it Miracle Meadows? One of those, no, it wasn't Miracle Meadows. It was the one that Blondell Sr. would run. Advent Home, yeah. So he was in an Advent Home, and there's a lot of working with their hands, and it's really good for ADHD students and things like that, and he began to do better. But one of the reasons he was sent to Advent Home straight from juvenile detention is his mother didn't feel safe with him at home and didn't think she was going to be able to manage him at all. And so with that type of background, he was declined to be admitted to Weimar Institute. But then when the board member told me that he actually did well, and I called Blondell Sr., and Blondell Sr. thought that, he's probably in a position to come there and do well, and he wanted to be a doctor. And, with the challenges he had, that was a pretty significant challenge. So he started taking biology and chemistry his freshman year. I had the enrollment committee review him again, and after with the additional information, they allowed him in. but he was getting like a C in those classes, not anywhere close to being able to get into medical school. But as a result of taking Optimize Your Brain, he learned about this 3D situation. And he said, I want to be transferred to work on the farm. Well, to work on the farm at Weimar, you can't just work 8 hours a week. At Weimar, you have to work, I think, a minimum of 6 or 8 hours a week. That's part of the process of being able to be enhanced as a student. So even all the pre-med students have to do that. And he was working the minimum. And of course, they told him, if you work 20 hours a week in agriculture and you're getting a C in things like chemistry and biology, what do you think it's going to be then? And he says, I want to optimize my brain. And he says, I don't know how else to be able to really do it well. And I see the research on working with your hands. I'll work the 20 hours. And so he went out there and worked the 20 hours on the farm. And what do you think happened to his science grades? He was studying less, but they started to improve. And the more he actually worked with chemistry and science, and the more he worked with his hands, it started to get better and better. And now, just last year, he graduated from Loma Linda, and with those original bad grades, they actually, to be safe, they actually put him in a master's program right along with the medical students, and they said, if you can handle this, you're in med school next year. And if you can't, then you'll get your master's degree in science and be able to do other things like that. So I'm not sure where he's at in the process, but it can tell you how different it can be as a result, and there would have been no chance for him to even get into that master's program without that. So back to the pen of inspiration, the sin of intemperate eating, eating too frequently, too much of rich, unwholesome food destroys the healthy action of the digestive organs, affects the brain, and does what? Perverts the judgment, preventing rational, calm, healthy thinking and acting. What area of the brain is this? The rational, calm, healthy thinking and acting. It's the frontal lobe. And the next statement is kind of interesting. And this is a fruitful source of what? Church trials. So the argument in the board meeting may not be due to what you think it's due to. It may be due to what the people ate before they got to the board meeting. And no matter how much you're discussing the subject, there's not enough frontal lobe positivity there going on to be able to think of the things in the principal, larger perspective. And thus, there is discord even on the church board. A couple of other areas we want to get into before we open it up for questions. Hypnosis is something that is being used in greater frequency today. This comes from a hypnosis textbook that promotes it. Hypnosis attempts by design to what? Cancel out frontal lobe functions and bring people into a trance in which they are what? Highly suggestible. And then it tells you how you can hypnotize people. There's difficult ways and easy ways, but the easiest way is to train the eyes to focus in on what? One object, the best object being a what? Little flickering light. So when the flicker occurs, it's irregular, but your eyes are focused in on it. What will happen? The person will record information and duties without interpretation or without frontal lobe activity. Now, many people may not be aware that they could have a hypnotic instrument in their own room. What trains the eyes to focus in on one object and flickers? And what produces the flicker in entertainment television? It's the scene of reference change. And that's how you can tell true educational versus entertainment TV is by how fast the scene of reference is changing. By the way, news, do you think that's educational or entertainment? It's entertainment because of the rapid scene of reference change that takes place at least in most news programs. And so when that rapid scene of reference changes, and no matter what your favorite television program, even if it seems like a benign television program, within 3 minutes, 90 seconds to 3 minutes, if you're on an EEG, we will see your beta waves drop off within 3 minutes. That means the frontal lobe goes dormant. And the emotions are still working. The memory's working enough that, if you see it a few years later, you recognize it as a rerun, that you've seen it before. but you're no longer critically analyzing the information that comes in. There have been over 3,000 studies done on the effect of entertainment television in the mind. Over 300 books have been written on the subject. And the evidence is very clear on what it does. Increases daydreaming. That's not a good thing. By the way, daydreaming has been, what is daydreaming? Daydreaming is when we are actually going into fantasy world. You know, what would be an example of that? Well, you're going through a line in the grocery store and you see People magazine with maybe Brad Pitt on the cover, and then you imagine that you're Brad Pitt's wife and living in his home or things like that. That's called daydreaming. And daydreaming has actually been shown to be one of the independent variables that increases the risk of dementia later on in life, where creativity does the opposite. And when daydreaming goes up, we'll also see creativity go down. Decreased interest in reading, decreased interest in learning, reduces discernment. It trains you in non-reaction when you should be reacting. It increases aggressiveness when you should not be reacting. It reduces your sensitivity to violence significantly. It's addictive as well. In fact, this was found in the 1970s. Withdrawal symptoms when you quit watching television abruptly. Of course, these are withdrawal symptoms that you can tolerate, or at least, but there will be increased risk of headaches, insomnia, those sorts of things, like getting off another frontal lobe suppressant. The more TV adolescents watch, the more likely they are to develop attention and learning problems and do poorly in school. The amount of TV kids watched when they were 14 was positively linked with having attention problems later, not doing homework, being bored at school, not finishing high school, and hating school, the researchers found. 14-year-olds who added one more daily hour of TV doubled their risk of academic failure at age 16. Just one more hour, you think it's benign, but it's doubling their risk of academic failure. And of course, I know in my own life, I think my life would have been far different had I been raised on entertainment television. My father was wise enough to not have one in the home, and I thought I was being severely mistreated as a result. But then later on, I realized someone else across, I grew up in suburban Detroit, and another individual grew up in downtown Detroit, and his mother got rid of the television when he was in 5th grade, and he was at the bottom of his class having all sorts of emotional problems. And without TV, he began to blossom, and his academic performance went up. And from downtown Detroit to a mother who didn't even know how to read and no father at all, he ended up getting into Yale and then into medical school. And he ended up becoming a creative neurosurgeon who separated the Siamese twins, Ben Carson. And he tells this story. It would have never happened had he had entertainment television in his home after that time. He said it was so wise of his mother. He just credits his mother for getting rid of that TV and getting rid of those screens. And by the way, even in regards to, well, let's talk about this before we close, because the other screens are also an issue. But certainly these screens take away from family achievement and spiritual pursuits, which are also important for the frontal lobe. Ellen White says something, TV wasn't around in her day, but she said something quite profound. There's no influence in our land more powerful to poison the imagination, to destroy religious impressions, and to blunt the relish for the tranquil pleasures and sober realities of life than what? Theatrical amusements. The love for these scenes increases with every indulgence as the desire for intoxicating drink strengthens with its use. The only safe course is to shun the theater, the circus, and every other questionable place of amusement. And then Alvin Toffler, a current media expert, says constant stimulation of the senses shuts down what? The analytical processes. So the constant scene of reference change, then you have the syncopated music that produces its issues, and it ultimately shuts down the ability to do what? Face life rationally. This leads to escape techniques that involve withdrawal, apathy, and rejection of what kind of thinking? Disciplined thinking when faced with difficult duties and decisions. And this is when we need disciplined thinking. This is when problems come into our life. This is the need for disciplined thinking. But yet, when there's a need for disciplined thinking, the typical person that's been constantly stimulating themselves will actually withdraw and reject disciplined thinking, which means they're going to make poor decisions, and it's even going to be a worse situation for them in the long run. And it all starts out by this constant stimulation of the senses. But we thought the solution to no TV was screens that were not television. Digital classroom tools like computers, tablets, and smartphones offer exciting opportunities to deepen learning through creativity, collaboration, and connection, but those very devices can also be distracting to students. Similarly, parents complain that when students are required to complete homework assignments online, it's a challenge for students to remain on task. Like I told you, within 5 minutes, they're no longer going to be doing their homework. And if students don't learn how to concentrate and shut out distractions, research shows they'll have a much harder time succeeding in almost every area of life. And that's because attention is under siege more than it has ever been before. The real message is because attention is under siege more than it's ever been in human history. We have more distractions than ever before. We have to be more what? Focused on cultivating the skills of attention. And if young students don't build up the neural circuitry that focused attention requires, they could have problems controlling their emotions and being empathetic. This is the message from Daniel Goleman, who wrote a book called Focus, the Hidden Driver of Excellence. And he says the circuitry for paying attention is identical for the circuits for managing distressing emotions. The attentional circuitry needs to have the experience of sustained episodes of concentration, reading the text, understanding and listening to what the reader is saying in order to build the mental models that create someone who's well educated. And so this is a key component. I told you about that anterior cingulate gyrus. That's the area that you also need to manage distressing emotions. So if you're not able to focus and not able to have good working memory, you're not going to be able to manage your emotions. And this is why people are doing self-mutilation. They're doing all sorts of alternative ways of altering the way they feel so they can take their mind off of their lack of ability to manage their emotions. And of course, that can be reversed and cured as well. So what does Daniel Goleman say? One of the keys to success is a what? Digital Sabbath. Does it say once a week? Every day. Sometime when kids, and he also could say adults, aren't being distracted by devices at all and are engaged in focused learning. And of course, the more screen time you have, studies show the less sleep. And circadian rhythm is an important element, as well as getting enough melatonin at night, which means it's best early to bed, early to rise. That's that nice melatonin peak. And if you delay your bedtime till late at night, you're going to get less of that melatonin peak. And studies have shown sleep is worth far more before than after midnight. 2 hours good sleep before 12 o'clock, worth more than 4 hours after 12 o'clock due to that melatonin output. And then music also has a role to play. I mentioned I was going to talk about this this morning, later on, but music enters the brain through its emotional regions, which include the temporal lobe and limbic system. That type of music that is frontal lobe enhancing has a positive influence on the will, moral worth, and reasoning power. This is a picture that I took when I lived in Oklahoma. I practiced in Ardmore, Oklahoma for 26 years, and that's southern Oklahoma. And so every year I would take our staff down to the Dallas Symphony Christmas concert. And, it was kind of interesting in this concert that one of the advantages of being in Dallas, it was the Protestant Mecca of the United States. The Methodists have their headquarters there, the Baptists have their headquarters, there's Baylor, there's all of these other universities. So unlike San Francisco Symphony, which is what I'm close to now, you can go to a Christmas concert there, but they're never going to sing Hark the Herald Angels Sing. They're not going to sing, Oh Come All Ye Faithful. They might sing Jingle Bells, but but it's not going to be the actual Christmas story. And the Dallas Symphony they'll even have one of these singers actually read the account. They won't be reading it, they'll have memorized the account out of Luke. And the orchestra will paint word pictures through that entire thing. It's just very frontal lobe enhancing. And I had one of our newer employees, before I left there, she said, I'd really like to go. I've never gone to anything like that before. But she said, my husband's not going to want to go because he's a heavy metalist and he doesn't like classical music and that sort of thing. But you know, one of the things I've learned, and of course I've had a lot of experience dealing with these musical issues through the years, but what I've learned is if it is good frontal lobe enhancing music, everyone's going to be able to enjoy it. It might not be the music they prefer, but they might enjoy it. So I told her that. I said, I can guarantee you that he's going to enjoy at least some aspects of the program. She goes, I'm glad you told me that. I'm going to tell him that. So he actually came. And he was a big heavy metalist, but after the program, he couldn't quit talking about multiple aspects of that program and how he loved the children's choir and how he loved the angels we have heard on high and those sorts of things. And you could see his engagement in frontal lobe activity occurring and actually improving as a result. Study of 6-year-olds found that those who took music lessons for 1 year scored more points on IQ tests compared with their peers not involved in music classes. Benefit was small. It was seen across the spectrum of abilities measured in the tests, including math, language, and spatial skills. And so one of the characteristics you'll see about a lot of high EQ and IQ individuals was having that musical training, because that music actually enhances all of the areas of the brain. And even the rock and rollers all learn classical music when they're 6 years old. They all learn that aspect of things, which of course includes some brain-enhancing aspects. Other kinds of music will evoke very little, if any, frontal lobe response, will produce a large emotional response with very little logical or moral interpretation. And this is characteristics of the more syncopated rock and roll rhythms that characterize the popular music of the day. And studies are very clear, upbeat music is not necessarily uplifting music. And so it has to do with the characteristics. This study from University of Florida showed that when people are encouraged to reflect on their past, present, and future while listening to classical music, it improves their mood and reduces stress. 6 sessions of classical music therapy were held over a 12-week period in 23 to 45-year-olds. These had never been seriously exposed to classical music. And the subjects showed after just 12 weeks improved scores on tests of overall mood, less depression, less fatigue, and their cortisol levels improved significantly. So there were actually neurohormonal benefits. And when the cortisol goes down, your memory and learning ability actually goes up. This was, again, the pen of inspiration back in 1900 when there was some syncopated rock and roll rhythms coming into the church in Indiana. And Ellen White was shown the things you have described as taking place in Indiana, the Lord has shown me would take place just before the close of probation. Every uncouth thing will be demonstrated. It will be shouting with drums, music, and dancing, and the senses of rational beings will become so confused that they cannot be what? Trusted to do what? Make right decisions. And it's the music behind it that was suppressing the frontal lobe. But she says when this music is played, it will actually be called the moving of the Holy Spirit. But we want the Holy Spirit to enhance the frontal lobe, not detract from it. So what are the characteristics of brains optimizing music? Melodious, it can be simple yet attractive. The consonant harmonies, the dissonant harmonies might be for a transition, but not centering in on the dissonance. Dissonance is also going to produce some adverse effects. And of course, the blue note in jazz is, creating that dissonance. It's called the blue note because it's been shown to induce the blues. And it's quite dissonant music. Straight rhythms or march rhythms as opposed to the continual syncopated rhythms. The rhythm less prominent in the melody and harmony, and where the music tells a story, where you can imagine a scene taking place. And it's also enhanced with reverent, uplifting music, where it has that reverential quality, like it enhances us something beyond ourselves. I didn't realize when I scheduled this weekend, I may not have scheduled it the way we did, but I'm glad it worked out. that Weimar Institute was going to be having their Christmas concert this weekend. Since I don't have Dallas Symphony, I go to Weimar Institute, and so they're doing it 3 times in Auburn, and tonight they're doing it at Weimar itself, and then tomorrow they're doing it in another city that's there. But those are the 6 characteristics, and of course this is, I saw in your bulletin, you're going to have Fountain View Academy and Orchestra coming within a few weeks, and when you're at Weimar and you see the college and academy combined and all of that musical talent, it seems like the best of the Fountain View students come to Weimar College, fortunately, and so it's like Fountain View on steroids with all of that. And so I get my own frontal lobe enhanced with that. But these 6 characteristics indeed are powerful. By the way, there's an online thing. I actually saw it. Somebody forwarded me a male chorus in Westminster Abbey recently, "O Love That Will Not Let Me Go." And it had those characteristics there, and it was just, if you can listen to it, very frontal lobe enhancing. Pretty exciting. But right underneath that, it was a YouTube, and I do better in listening to the music instead of watching the performance, too. So I like to actually just listen to it and not watch the performance. But right underneath that, there was a talk by a musicologist on the transforming power of classical music. And it was a TED Talk, actually, but he was demonstrating with the piano those things and why it actually is transformative in everybody if they engage in it. And he made a very convincing evidence. You guys would very much enjoy it. It's just an 8-minute TED Talk on how some people think only 4% of people are really engaged and really excited about classical music. But he talked about the other 96% in this and how it can actually help their brain as well in regards to engaging. In our program, we actually have people get to the creativity point by the end of the program. Of course, we have a great music person to go through this. I don't teach the music and the music therapy part of our program. One of our music teachers at Weimar College, who's very much into, he can play any type of music, and he's very much into the effects of music. He will actually teach our participants, now that their frontal lobe is enhancing, to be able to write their own songs and utilizing their own life experiences and those sorts of things. And it's very exciting to see the brain wake up with that sort of thing. In regards to our interests, Philippians 4:8 is a good thing even for music. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is worthy of reverence, honorable, seemly, whatever is just, pure, lovely, lovable, whatever is kind and winsome and gracious, if there is any virtue and excellence, anything worthy of praise, think on and weigh and take account of these things. And that's what music is for, to be able to fix our mind on these things. And some of the music today, you just can't call it, no heavy metalist would call their music kind and winsome and gracious. They wouldn't call it lovely or lovable per se. And so some music isn't just going to be able to classify it this way, but if you can indeed accurately classify it this way, it can be a very powerful influence. So in summary, take care of our frontal lobe, protect it from mechanical injury, supply it with good oxygen, good exercise, good deep breathing, get good nutrition, get adequate sunlight. That's also important. The bright light to get serotonin, exercise it just like a muscle. If we don't use it, we're going to lose it. Control the inputs over what we're seeing and hearing and correct distorted thoughts. That also helps our frontal lobe by analyzing our thoughts for distortion and preventing or controlling disease that affects it. There's no better way of exercising than what the people of Acts did. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica, and that they received the word with all what? Readiness of mind, and did what? Search the scriptures weekly, does it say? Daily, whether those things were so. So it was an analytical exercise of searching good spiritual material and enhancing the frontal lobe. So if you want to be more intelligent or more analytical or make better decisions or a greater capacity to empathize with others, better discernment, better reasoning skills, better ability to overcome an addiction, or a greater power to follow your conscience, I'd like you to think about your life and see what you can change habitually to enhance your own frontal lobes. And you will indeed be more open to understanding and doing the will of the Lord as well when that frontal lobe enhances. And of course, there's been people throughout history, including students at Weimar, that are coming out with great frontal lobes. But remember, Daniel and his 3 friends, they made a choice to have different diet than the culture, different entertainment than the culture. And Ellen White, speaking of them, says, "Dear youth, God calls upon you to do a work which through His grace you can do. Show a purity of taste, appetite, and habits that bears comparison with who? Daniel's, and God will reward you," she said, "with 4 things: calm nerves, clear brain, unimpaired judgment, keen perceptions." The youth of today, whose principles are firm and unwavering, will be blessed, not may be blessed, but will be blessed with what? Health of body, mind, and soul. And fortunately, there are youth taking advantage of that and doing that today. Our brains are built for continual improvement. They're designed that way. And Ellen White says, "The Lord has given man capacity through our brains for continual improvement, has granted him all possible aid in the work. Through the provisions of divine grace, we may attain almost to the excellence of angels." But we do this by following principles. "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God," says Paul, "that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice." Some people would think to live a lifestyle of brain optimization, it would be too much of a sacrifice for them. They may not want to give up this aspect of their diet, or they may not want to give up this substance that they're needing to, quote, feel better, even though it suppresses their frontal lobe, or their entertainment, or their screens. But that's why it says a living sacrifice. You're living, but the sacrifice normally means death. So death to your desires, but put a death to those desires and not practice them, and be acceptable unto God, which Paul doesn't say. Some people would call it extremism. What does Paul call it? He says it's your reasonable service. "Be not conformed to this world, but be ye" what? "Transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." And then the wise man in Proverbs says, "Wisdom is better than rubies." If you have it, a lot of people would go for the rubies before wisdom every time, but that's a big mistake. Wisdom is far better than rubies, and Solomon knew, because he had rubies as well. And all the things that may be desired are not to be compared to it. So no matter what your desires are, if wisdom is not on your top priority list, your desires are, you're having problems with magnification and minimization. You're majoring in minors and minoring in majors. And the number one desire should indeed be wisdom. And that's why we need to not only learn the principles of optimizing our brain, but practice those principles.